Hey guys, Katie here, and today I'm talking about Ernest Hemingway's A Moveable Feast. This is the restored edition. Ernest Hemingway wrote this memoir when he was alive. Later in his life, he edited it, he put it together, and actually meant to publish it, but didn't get around to it. And so eventually his last wife edited it and published it, and then years later his grandson, by another wife, re-edited it, added things back in, and published it under the restored edition. Now, I don't want to say this is exactly a review because, with classics, they've been reviewed, they've been talked about. This is really more of a discussion, maybe, about my experience with this book. When I was younger, I was forced to read The Old Man and the Sea, and of course I hated it because I think I was 16, and what 16-year-old wants to read Hemingway? At the time, I was obsessed with Harry Potter, probably, and didn't really care about anything else. A few years later, I had become a full-on Jane Austen addict, and I argued quite often with my friend about who was better, Jane Austen or Ernest Hemingway. I'm not sure if that's really a fair argument, though. They're completely different. I staunchly refused to read any more Hemingway because I just didn't like how sad and depressing his writing was. Then a few years ago, I saw Midnight in Paris, and that is an awesome movie, by the way. In Midnight in Paris, of course, Owen Wilson's character magically is transported back into the 1920s, where he befriends famous writers, artists, musicians, including Ernest Hemingway. And there was something about that actor who played Hemingway that made me really enjoy his voice. I know that sounds weird, but hearing someone speak as Ernest Hemingway made me feel like I could really enjoy his writing, actually. So I picked A Moveable Feast because it's his memoir from his time in Paris in the 1920s. In the 1920s, Hemingway was writing as a journalist, living in Paris with his wife Hadley, and eventually they had a son. It's quite interesting to hear about all the places he loved to go, the cafes where he would drink or write, where he worked, how he worked, and he talks a lot about writing and reading even. So I think it's a really interesting peek into Hemingway and basically his approach to life at this point in time. It's funny because what I think that I originally disliked about him is what I like about him now, and what is encouraging me to read more of his books, and that is the way that he writes so honestly and no frills, he just writes a sentence and lets it go, and it's so different from what most people do that I think you can't help but be a little bit intrigued. Another interesting thing about this book is Hemingway's depiction of other famous artists and writers like Gertrude Stein, who you see in Midnight in Paris, but I think Hemingway's observations of her are much more interesting. Ezra Pound, also James Joyce, they all play a major part in making Hemingway the writer that he eventually became. Every chapter in A Moveable Feast is sort of an excerpt, a little story from his life. You get a varied idea of what he was up to. You definitely get the sense that he had kind of a problem with gambling. He goes to the horse races and bets on horses. Hemingway didn't have a lot of money, but he was still able to get around. He traveled to Austria quite a bit and elsewhere in France. He and his wife just did all of these fun things whenever they had the means, but otherwise they kind of had to live frugally. There is quite a bit of controversy surrounding this edition of the book, as well as the original edition that was edited by his wife Mary, partially because, as you may know, Hemingway had several wives and several children, and one of his wives was not favorably painted in this book, whereas his last wife, Mary, was the one to edit it, so she kind of had full reign on what went in, what didn't go in. You can imagine that that completely alters what's going on in the book, and changes maybe what Hemingway himself intended for his own memoirs. I think you can come away from this book with a lot of questions, such as which is the better edition, which might be more true to what Hemingway was writing. It is said to treat the original edition as the true edition and to treat the restored edition as sort of supplementary. There are excerpts here that were taken out of the original, and the order is supposed to be more true to what Hemingway wanted. So who knows? I don't know. I'm kind of glad I read the restored edition because I got the foreword by his son Patrick, and it gave me a lot of information about what A Moveable Feast was and about Hemingway himself. I enjoyed that, and I also did enjoy some of the things that were added in, the alternate endings. It's kind of fun to see that, to see the method behind the writer. That's interesting. In this quote on page 58 of the restored edition, which I think was in the movie Midnight in Paris, Gertrude Stein says, "You should only read what is truly good or what is frankly bad." I like that because I like reading bad novels. Can't help it. Anyway, I set out to read some Hemingway and I actually enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and I would recommend it, especially because it's set in Paris. If you like Paris, if you liked Midnight in Paris, you will enjoy this book, I promise. It's pretty quick and an interesting and enlightening read. So I hope you'll read it if you're interested. If not, that's okay. There are other people to read. So I guess that's it for my review of A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. If you have any thoughts about this book, let me know in the comments. If you have any suggestions for other Ernest Hemingway books to read, some that are maybe similar or whatever, let me know. And I hope you are having a great day. I will see you later. Bye.